Good afternoon. Welcome to Door County Reads 2024. I believe this is number 17.
Wow.
Doing this since 2008. I'm Alan Kapishke. And the reason I'm here, as I have been for every Door County Reads since 2008, is that I started working for Peninsula Players in 2007, and they said, we want something to happen in the winter. And I said, okay, let me see what I can do, and I applied to the National Endowment for the Arts for a grant for what they call the Big Read, which was the brainchild of Laura Bush, and started a few years earlier. And we got a grant, and Peninsula Players partnered with Door County Library, and we launched this whole deal. The library took it over from the Players a few years later, but it has kept going every single year since 2008. And I think that is a remarkable accomplishment. We as a community have been reading together and loving books together and sharing insights about them, and through a remarkable series of events, usually centered around different aspects, artistic aspects. We have play readings, we have art exhibits, we have music concerts, dances, book discussions, historical presentations, author talks, all sorts of stuff that help us view these books from so many different angles and share that experience together. What a great thing for us to do during the winter. So today, in preparation for this, I grabbed my 10-year mug. So this has, the book covers the first 10 reads that we did. The first one was The Grapes of Wrath, and we went on from there. And we have done, great old classics. We have done brand new books. We have done fiction. We have done nonfiction. We have done some really heavy reads, and we've done some light, fun ones. We've really covered a broad range, and how wonderful that this beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and the one for young adults, that we're weaving this lovely book into the wonderful tapestry of books that we have collected over the years. It's just terrific. So, look, your library staff has done a remarkable job of putting all this stuff together, as they always do. They know a lot more about what's going on this year than I do. But I want to hand things over right now to one of those folks who's put a lot of work into this year's set of events. Christina Johnson, who is the director of the Sister Faith branch.
For our land acknowledgement, we would like to share that the Door County Reads Committee acknowledges the original peoples and primary caretakers of this peninsula from time immemorial: the Potawatomi, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, Odawa, Ojibwe, Petun, Huron, and Sauk peoples. The land we stand on today is part of the ancestral and historical homelands of each of these nations. We pay respect to these roots and connections and the traditional ecological knowledge that is present and vital today. May we appreciate those who came before us and commit to partnering with and learning from First Nations today and into the future. We are honored to share this time together. And now I'd like to pass it over to our director, Dominic Cranbrook, director of Door County Libraries of our 8 branches here.
Before I forget, if you are on Zoom, we request that you please stay muted, and if you're in the audience, mute your cell phones, because this is being recorded. This afternoon's program is funded in part by a grant from Wisconsin Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the state of Wisconsin. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this project do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I did want to say that we regret to inform you that Fire Nation has been unable to attend here today, but that just means we'll have more time with Dr. J P Leary. So Dr. J P Leary serves as the Associate Professor in First Nation Studies, Histories, and Humanities at University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, as a member of the graduate faculty in the Professional Program in Education, and as a faculty affiliated with the Education Center for First Nation Studies. He regularly teaches a variety of courses, including Introduction to First Nation Studies, the Tribal World, American Indians in Film, Mohican Ethno-History, First Nations and Education Policy, and the First Nations Studies Seminar. His primary research interests relate to curriculum policy, the history of education, and the representation and self-representation of Native people in education and popular culture. Dr. Leary is also the faculty advisor for the Intertribal Student Council. Let's welcome Dr. J P Leary.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes.
All right, the mic is on then. Siona guys, good afternoon. My name is J P Leary, as you heard, and I am a faculty member at UW Green Bay. I am originally from Chicago. Both my parents are from there. I come from Cherokee, Delaware, and other indigenous and European peoples on my dad's side, and mostly Scottish and Irish peoples on my mother's side. And as Cherokee people, we come from our mother's people. That's where we get our clan from. And so I proudly stand before you today and proclaim my clan as Southside Irish. That's where I come from, and how I kind of situate myself as a mixed person, right? And so I've been at UW Green Bay for almost 13 years now. And before that, I was at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and I was working in the American Indian Studies program. And I was going to school at UW-Madison, which is where I met Christina Johnson. And so we go way back. And I was saying that it was just an honor to be asked and to have the opportunity to reconnect with her in person. I don't know, the last time we saw each other. So that's really good. And I'm really grateful that there are so many here today. And I'm going to share a few things of what I've learned. And I'm going to do my best to do it. I want to acknowledge all of our elders in the audience, Native and non-Native elders who are present, and who may be out there in TV land too. I want to acknowledge all of our audience members. And I ask your patience and your indulgence as I do the best that I can with what I've learned. So I want to talk a little bit about lifelong learning in First Nation Studies, and to share a little bit about a concept that's been really central in my work in this field, and that is that of opportunity to learn. All right, and so just thinking about what we've had the opportunity to learn throughout our formal schooling, throughout our lived experiences, and other aspects of our life. So in thinking about our prior opportunities to learn, I do an exercise in my classrooms at UW Green Bay for most of the classes that I teach. And I want to get a sense of what folks are coming in with, what they've had the prior opportunity to understand. And so as we think about school, what I do is I talk about something that professional educators and psychologists might know of as schema theory, right? And it's the way that we take in and we organize information in our minds. And kind of metaphorically, it's a mental file folder in a mental filing system, all right? Now, so what I would encourage you to think about, and I'm not going to make you get out paper and pen and write all this out. You're not my students, right? And so I would ask you to think about this as a thought exercise for today. And so as you think about what have been offered to you about Native people in school, what opportunities existed elsewhere, such as your public library, such as in faith communities, such as in civic organizations, what have you had the opportunity to learn? What have you had the opportunity to learn about Native people? What then is in your mental file folder? So part of the idea behind schema theory is that we are taking in information at every waking moment that we have. And we are organizing, and those things that we do every day, we might think about that as we got a really thick folder, or maybe we got a really whole drawer on some of those things, right? Maybe your commute back and forth to work. There comes a point where you don't really got to think about that too much, you just go, right? But new experiences were maybe a little more intentional about thinking about those folders. And you've probably noticed something, is that I used First Nations in the title of the talk, yeah? And then this says, what have you learned about Native people? And then this says American Indians. You may be wondering, what are we supposed to call you? Right? Right? That's a real common question. And here's what I say. I tend to use Native with a capital N. I tell my students it's a proper adjective. Now, linguists and English teachers might say such a thing doesn't exist, but I say we need it to exist and we can make it up, yeah? Right? We can create those things that meet our needs. Why can't we create cognitive tools? We can invent everything else. So we're going to create this thing, Native, as a proper adjective, always capitalized, right? Now, there are all these different terms. And so Indian goes back to Columbus, right? Looking for the Indies, so that's where that term comes from. Indian is also in many of the founding documents of this nation. We see the term Indian in the United States Constitution. We see references to Native people in the Declaration of Independence. You know what that phrase is? Merciless Indian savages. Yeah, that was one of the grievances lodged against the British Crown. The merciless Indian savages. And so we see that that term remains a term of art in federal Indian policy in the United States law. There's a whole volume, Title 25, United States Code, says in the spine, Indians. And that is a body of law that shapes and regulates the interactions between the federal government of the United States and Native peoples across within the United States boundaries, all right? And they recognize a government-to-government relationship with those indigenous peoples. All of that goes into the term Indian. You will see in some government documents the term American Indian. When I was at the Department of Public Instruction, I was there in 1996 to 2011, we were the American Indian Studies program. If you go on to UW-Madison to this day, it's the American Indian Studies program. So there's that term, right? And that term sort of has its origins of differentiating South Asian people who are the true Indians. Then there's the term Native American, and Native American, and in my view, and in my lived experience, in my memory, emerged probably in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when I was in college at UW-Eau Claire. We were the Native American Student Association, NASA. It's my initials are JPL, and you know what? NASA has a branch called the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I've always thought that that was pretty cool. And so Native American sort of comes from that era in which people were reclaiming their hyphens, right? People from diverse ancestries were really going back saying, who are my people? Where do we come from? And embracing that hyphen. And I think that's pretty cool too. So as we think about all of these different terms, and First Nations, by the way, really comes out of a Canadian context. That's where that term emerged. And First Nations really represents that idea of Indigenous peoples as being the First Nations of these lands. And having that nationhood and that sovereignty that predates that of Canada, the United States, Mexico, any of those other sovereign nations in the hemisphere. First Nations shows that our sovereignty, our nationhood predates all of that, okay? So that's where that comes from, and that's coming into the United States at this time. So then, how do we work through all of these different terms? In my own classroom, I tell my students that we are not going to magic word each other. That what I want to do is do our best to communicate in good faith, listen for understanding, think about whether communication has indeed occurred, and if there's something that we need to talk about, we can do that in a way that's a little less public and open and confrontational, right? We might do, I've talked with students briefly after class and said, I see where you're going with this, but there might be a better way to say it, and we'll talk about what that is. In a way that doesn't embarrass them, recognizes their intent, all right? And that's my intention for today, all right? So that same thing holds true here. And so as we think about what's in our mental file folder, and as we think about all these different terms, they're all kind of right and they're all kind of wrong. They all have their nuanced meaning, and all of them are an umbrella term that groups together linguistically and culturally diverse peoples across an entire continent, right? And what we have in common is that shared experience with colonialism and with the United States and with Canada and with these other powers, right? That's what creates these umbrellas. So they're all kind of right and they're all kind of wrong. So my solution to that is we can use them interchangeably because there's not really one right answer. Do you see? And as we think about this, now, I've been married a long time, and my wife is smarter than me. Maybe that's why I've been married a long time. And her name is Adrienne Thunder, and she is currently the language division manager for the Ho-Chunk Nation. And for many years, we were going around and we were doing workshops for civic organizations and for faith communities and for school districts and all this. And we were going to different conferences and whatnot. And we were doing all-day to half-day workshops. And one of the things that she designed as part of our work together was this prior knowledge activity, right? And being the educator that I am, I've made it overcomplicated. But the simple version that she came up with is really brilliant, and it's a really good way to start these kind of conversations. And so in my own classroom, and again, this is I'm asking you to think about it as a thought activity, right? I'm asking you to think about these questions. I'm not asking you to write them down. In my classroom, what I do is we do a lot of collaborative work, right? We're in small groups every day. And I have my students brainstorm an answer to this question. And I remind them that when we're brainstorming, we're not evaluating our ideas, right? We're not saying, oh, I don't want to say that, that's probably wrong. Or I don't know what they're going to think if I say something dumb, right? We're not evaluating our ideas when we're brainstorming, we're just throwing things out that are top of mind, right? And so include everything positive, negative, neutral, and I say 1 minute, ready, go. Right? What? I said, no, ready, go. So that they do it. And at the end of a minute, I said, well, how many of you got 3 or more? How many of you got 5 or more? So we're doing that. And so at that point, I reassure them that this is not an inventory of all you know. This is what was top of mind under a particular set of circumstances, yeah? Right? I thought, oh, phew, that lets some of the pressure off if we think about it that way. And so we do that. And then, so that's 1 minute now. The next step, I give them 5 minutes. We've got to move quick, right? So I ask them, well, how do you know that? What was the source of that information? And be specific. I tell them, don't just say Star Wars. Don't just say a movie, say Star Wars, right? They say, well, what will we learn from Star Wars? Well, 1, I don't know. But 2, Star Wars has been translated into the Navajo language. Right? That's kind of cool. And what?
It just came out.
Did it?
Yes.
Okay. Are we going to have streaming over here?
I would love that.
I would come. Okay. And so instead of books, say it was in Little House on the Prairie, or whatever it was, right? Where did you learn these things? And what I find is that students often don't know. When I was working with professional educators, often they don't know either, right? Go back to that idea of schema theory. We are walking in the world, taking in data and experiences and making memories in every waking moment, yeah? We're not necessarily citing our sources using APA 7, right? And so I do that. And in my classroom, again, we're not going to do that today, I make it complicated. I say, we're doing research together. We are researching ourselves, and we're thinking about what we're going to do with this. So in a sense, a form of action research. So I haven't coded their data. I say, oh, this is what you've collected. You've done data collection. First step in a research process, good for you. Round of applause for yourselves, then we're going to code it. And I have them tell how many are assertions of fact. And I'm very deliberate with that phrasing, assertion of fact. Right? I don't ask them how many of them are true. I ask them how many of them did you list because you understand them to be true or you believe them to be so. And if we were to do a little bit of fact checking, would they hold up or not? That's a different task, right? But those things that are verifiable would go there. How many of statements of belief, value, or opinion, mark it with a B? Roll it, mark it with a B. My students don't know that one. The difference, of course, is if I say, I can make corn soup, go down with a plus. If I say, I make the best corn soup you ever had, that'd be a B. But it's also true. And so we would do that coding. And then sometimes they get real hung up and, well, I don't know how this is and I want it to be right. And depending on how you frame it, how you tip it, if we were to spend more than 1 minute generating these ideas, we could code it a lot of different ways. But for our purposes for this exercise, we just mark it 0 and move on with our lives. It gives me the opportunity to work in a big Lebowski joke that nobody understands either. So, and then we talk about how many of the references that you've generated are from the 20th or 21st century, right? And I have students that say things like, well, back in the late 1900s, right? Lower your voice, which how many of them are from the 20th or 21st century? But a lot of them are talking about things like Jean Nicolet, right? They're talking about, the Trail of Tears comes up very often in my classroom, but students don't really know what that is. It's just something they've heard of. So we mark those with a star if they're recent. Then we get into scholarly academic sources. How many of those things that you've learned from are scholarly academic sources? And we talk about, well, what does that mean? Well, peer review is the gold standard for scholarly academic sources, and we get into that. And then invariably someone says, we listed our 4th grade social studies class. What do we do with that, right? And you know how some conversations are more interesting for the flow of the conversation than the actual decision that gets made? This is always one of those. And so I asked them, well, what do you think about that? And my view, which comes out at the end, is that it is for a 4th grader, right? It is put forward as if it is a scholarly academic source for a 4th grader. They're like, yeah, but textbooks are problematic. And that gives me the opportunity to say yes, and so is peer review, because that speaks to a process, right? Not the particular quality of any particular piece of scholarship. If you read a book review, right? Things might pass a peer review process. And other scholars say, yeah, but you left this out and you got this wrong, but this was pretty good, right? So it doesn't really speak to quality, it speaks to process. So scholarly academic source, sure, yes, your 4th grade history book. And what I find is that most of my students, and this was true of the teachers I worked with for years, their understanding primarily stops at about 5th grade. That's where they've had the opportunity to learn. Most of what they know is what they can half remember from learning Wisconsin history in elementary school, right? And so then again, which sources reflect Indigenous knowledge? And if you are reading Braiding Sweetgrass, you have the opportunity to interact with Indigenous knowledge. Right? Robin Wall Kimmerer's teachings are that body of collective cultural knowledge, as well as her own research and observations that is an outgrowth of those same kind of Indigenous scientific processes that we've always engaged with. If you're unsure, again, mark it 0, and even if I explain my Big Lebowski joke on the previous slide, they still don't get it right here. And then thinking about point of view. Whose point of view have you experienced in the materials that you've learned from? And that becomes one of the things that I confront. One of my phobias of doing math in public. I have them sort their list. Circle all of your sources that have a native perspective or come from a native author. And I ask them to give me 2 numbers. Your total number of responses in your sources, and how many of them are a native perspective. And so then I'm tallying them all up, and I'm doing math, and thank goodness we have an engineering program now at UW Green Bay, because I got kids in the room that can check my math like this, right? So that's pretty cool too. And so we get through this, and what I found is that in the matter of that point of view, what I find is that my students, in aggregate, now I'm not talking about any individual student, but collectively as a class, it has been anywhere from 3 to 1 non-native to native perspectives in what they've learned, to 17 to 1. Right? Now, that is absolutely not a moral judgment on the character of any individual in that classroom. It speaks simply to what they have had the opportunity to learn prior to this exercise. Okay? And then what I explained is that what we are doing in our classroom is that we are reading almost exclusively Native voices. Not because that's the only valid body of scholarship about Native people, but because we are very intentionally rebalancing that knowledge base. They have not had the opportunity to hear those Native voices. So we're rebalancing that. And as you think about the statements maybe that you had in mind as we're walking through this, if we were to fact check those things that you might have listed in your mental what we know, how many of them would withstand that fact checking? How many of them might we say, that's accurate? How many of your sources we might say are accurate or authentic, speaking to their factual nature, speaking to their perspective, right? What I mean by authenticity is when the people recognize themselves in the descriptions provided, right? When I talk about the red mesas and brilliant saguaro cactuses in Door County, right? I would lose all credibility if I were to do so, right? That would be inauthentic because you, based on your lived experience, would say that's not right, we know better. Don't know what book you got that out of, but we know better. And so as we think about our prior learning opportunities, what have we learned about Native people that has prepared us for our professional responsibilities? Whatever those may be. And as we think about that, I did a lot of work with teachers, I still do a lot of work with teachers. And so I think about what have they learned that helps them to serve Native kids in their classroom, work with families and communities, all of those things that we ask our teachers to do, right? Have we equipped our teachers to work with the families of all of their students? And I have a lot of students that take this particular course, the Intro to First Nation Studies, as a general education course. And so one of the things I talk about is, why are we doing this? And, I make my arguments about the importance of a liberal arts-based education, the importance of the humanities, all of the kinds of skills that gives us in terms of close and analytical reading, critical thinking, the ability to communicate effectively in writing and orally, and all of these things. And what really grabs them is when I show data from the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development that shows that tribal governments and tribal governmentally operated entities are among the top, if not the top employer in many Wisconsin counties. They're not going to move overseas, right? And Oneida Nation alone, well, this is pre-pandemic data, had an economic footprint of $750 million, according to a study by St. Albans College. And so I asked them, if you want to, do you see the value of these things, of these ideas that we're going to be working through? If you are working for, they told me I need to say soft drink distributor, for example, because Coke dealer means something different. So if you're working for the soft drink distributor in Green Bay, think about how many one-stops Oneida Nation has. Think about how many vending machines there are at the casino. Thinking about all of these places where that is served, right? And if you have that little bit more understanding of your actual and potential customer base, doesn't that give you an advantage in the business world? Like, oh yeah, and then they listen. And so, but beyond our professional responsibilities, we're full human beings, right? We're not just workers of one type or another. And as we think about being good neighbors to each other, being engaged citizens in our communities, right? The other thing is, as we think about demographics, Native peoples are about 1.5% of the population. If we are to get justice, if we are to get our needs met within a democratic society, we need an informed populace that understands these ideas and can be allies, right? That's critically important. So good neighbors and engaged citizens. So this is what I think about when I think about First Nation studies and learning about Native people and where we're at. So whatever ideas you might have in your mind as you think about prior learning, and sometimes students say, well, I probably was taught it, but I can't remember. That was an insight I gleaned through my dissertation research. I went to UW-Madison, my doctorate's from there, and I wrote about Act 31. And I called my dissertation The Tangled Roots of Act 31. And someone asked me, well, why didn't you use that for your book title? I said, well, because I untangled them. That was no longer true. But we got to talking about opportunity to learn versus what was taught, right? And I think about my second grade teacher, Miss Knutson in Fairmont, Minnesota. And Miss Knutson had been to Thailand, and she taught us about Thailand. And we bartered, and we moved our desks together, and we created the kind of floating market that they have in Thailand. And we did all of this really engaging stuff. So to this day, second grade was 40 plus years ago. Math in public, right? It was a long time ago. And there are some things that I remember from Ms. Knudsen because it was taught in an engaging way. She was confident, and she was just plain good at her job, right? What I see with a lot of the teachers that I work with is they're not confident about what they're teaching. The man on the screen is Basil Johnston. And the late Basil Johnston was a very prolific author, Ojibwe author Basil Johnston. And in my classroom, I use his book, The Four Hills of Life. Or his book, The Ojibwe Heritage. He's got the story in there called The Four Hills of Life. And the story, and let's be humble and clear about what this is that this story lives orally in the space between the storyteller and the audience. So what he has in the book is a printed static version that is essentially summarized and translated into English, right? So we're not reading the story, we're reading about the story. Do you see? I think that's an important distinction. So as we read about that story, it is about a young man who has a dream. And as we often do in our communities, he goes to an elder in his community and he said, can you help me understand this? And it is, as I think about it, in a sense, it's a theory of human growth and development. It's about our growth along the life cycle. It is about our responsibilities to our community at each stage. It's about the responsibilities our communities have to us. It's that reciprocity that's built into those relationships. All of those things along the way. And in infancy and in childhood, right? Relatives and community members are preparing that young person for the next stage in life. Thinking about what will be asked of you as a child as you're contributing to meeting the community's needs. Are you learning to grow corn? Are you learning to do different things? Are you learning stories? Are you learning songs? All along the way. there's an important rite of passage called the vision quest that happens between childhood and adulthood. And as an outgrowth of that experience and that transition into adulthood, that person, that man, that woman, they become responsible then for seeking out their own opportunities to learn. Men learn their purpose and the meaning of their life through that vision quest. And so based on all of those things that ground you in your community, you have those responsibilities and you live them out. And just like the young man in the story of the Four Hills of Life, you seek out those who know, those who seek out more than you, to create those learning opportunities for yourself. And even when we ask our elders, right, sometimes we'll ask our elders those really hard questions. And one of my elders, he's since passed away, we were talking one day, and we got to thinking about this scenario of Bigfoot in the parking lot, right? If we were to see Bigfoot in the parking lot, and I would come to him and say, I saw Bigfoot in the parking lot. And he'd say, huh? And he'd think about it. And he'd say, you know, maybe we got a story about that. I'm going to ask somebody. And if we think about that mental file folder, that mental filing cabinet, that's going to be one of those really thin folders, right? And that maybe this elder over here, they heard a story from their uncle. Yeah, I think I know something about that. And we're combining a file folder. And so even our elders are going to each other, right? That's that form of research. And so we're doing that throughout our lives. That's lifelong learning. And it becomes our responsibility as adults. And according to the AARP, I am an elder too. I don't know if that works. But it is our responsibility to be seeking knowledge and wisdom throughout the entirety of our lives. And it's no longer provided to us in a prescriptive way where someone else is saying, I know what you need to know and be able to do. Right? It's you are knowing. You are following your own interests. So that's how that goes. And he wrote a ton of good stuff in English and in Ojibwe. I wrote a book too. And I called it The Story of Act 31. This is my awkward transition if you weren't sure about it, as I talk about my own book. And it came out from the Wisconsin Historical Society Press in 2018. And this is an extension of my dissertation research, which is an extension of my professional work and some of these things. And so people always say, well, where did this come from? And it really is kind of a lifelong learning kind of thing, right? And I guess I would also include my family members in a more direct way, right? As that learning what does it mean to be a Native person in mostly these urban intertribal contexts in which I've been raised and which I've continued to learn as an adult. But this was part of my English 110 paper, my freshman comp at UW Clare. I went back to that paper and I thought, hey, this is pretty good. And I was able to rework it, and some of that is in the dissertation, and some of that's in the book. A lot of that research is. And of course, so many of the people, right, as that we have that responsibility to seek out those who know. And you see a list, and maybe you recognize some of these names. Ron Sachs was a really important mentor for me at UW Clare, as was Vita Stone. Alan Caldwell was my predecessor at the Department of Public Instruction. Former Representative Sharon Metz, co-founder of Honor Our Neighbors, Origins and Rights. Former State Representative, UWGB alum, Representative Sharon Metz. There's a scholarship named for her and her husband Tom that several of us who knew them, worked with them, and learned from them, have created. Dana Jackson from Bad River, the late Dorothy W. Davids, and so many others were people that I knew, right? People that I had worked with, people that I learned from. And I was at DPI for a long time. And I wrote my dissertation, Tangled Roots of Act 31. And my committee was saying, you don't know what students learned, you only know what they had the opportunity to learn, right? Unless you have student work product. I thought, oh yeah. So I had to step back and be a little more humble about what I'm concluding. Then I wrote the book. Act 31. As you likely know, every legislative session that has 31 bills signed into law has an Act 31. This particular one is from 1989, and it has provisions related to American Indian Studies, created the program at DPI, provided some appropriations. Here are the statutory requirements. One was a directive to the Department of Public Instruction to create curriculum on Chippewa treaty rights. The next was around some human relations instruction that needed to happen beyond just Native people, right? And it reads, it includes Black Americans and Hispanics in the language in the statute. Teacher educational licensing, we can't ask our teachers to do what we haven't taught them, right? They have that opportunity to learn that's necessary as well. Instructional materials and school libraries. This is one of those things where we need to provide our students with the opportunity to be global citizens, right? To not stigmatize the towns in which they're growing up, but to help them know how to be good neighbors and engaged citizens wherever they may be. Right? So they may have grown up in Seymour, Wisconsin, and may be working remotely for a company in Japan, for example, right? So what have our schools and community organizations provided them with the opportunity to learn? And so we have to help them raise their horizons so they're not just thinking about where I am right now. And this is often thought of as the heart of Act 31, K-12 social studies. And to put this in perspective, Wisconsin is still thought of as a local control state, right? Local control of education. Meaning that most of the decisions that affect schools are made by that locally elected school board. Now, that shifted over the past 25 or so years, but we are still much more of a local control state than many others. And that's been a very proud tradition in Wisconsin, that notion of local control. And so this is that language around social studies curriculum enacted in 1989. All right? We see a start date. As part of social studies, include instruction in the history, culture, and tribal society, federally recognized American Indian tribes and bands located in the state at least twice in elementary grades, meaning K-8, and at least once in high school. So we're really talking about minimum 3 opportunities to learn in the context of social studies instruction, yeah? Now, we look at it from our 2023, 2024 mindset, and we say, what does include instruction mean? Right? What does it mean to include instruction? And you know, that conversation happened almost immediately after passage. They had the state superintendent appearing before the Joint Ledge Council American Indian Study Committee. And they were asking that superintendent, what does this mean? And he said, I'm going to ask you to fill in the blank. I certainly wouldn't expect a whole blank on it. What do you think?
Class.
Semester, course, unit, year. He said week. Right? I certainly wouldn't expect a whole week on it. Oh, right? Oh. But if you spend a whole week on it, you spend a whole day on it, doesn't that mean you've included instruction? Right? You can meet the letter of the law without having provided a meaningful opportunity to learn, you see? Goes back to that concept of opportunity to learn. But this was, as you see on the slide, the most specific curriculum directive to date at that time. And as we read it now, it's almost impossibly vague, yeah? Now, here's where this comes from. When I was a student at UW-Madison, and I had to go find resources for my papers, and I'd go find Christina Johnson in the American Indian Studies Program Library in Inter Hall, right? And one of the things that was really being drilled into us is that policy is a solution to a problem that gets defined in a particular way, right? And so we saw the policy, so what's the problem? And this is part of the source of the problem, right? Although arguably it's not this. The Ojibwe bands in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota reserved the right to hunt, fish, and gather within the territory that they ceded or sold to the United States government. They reserved the right to hunt, to fish, and to gather. 1836 covers Michigan, 3742 Wisconsin, 54 part of Wisconsin and Minnesota. And for generations, the state began to interfere with the exercise of those legally reserved rights. And under the United States Constitution, treaties are part of the supreme law of the land under Article 6 and have therefore a higher status than state conservation code. Nonetheless, people were fined, they were jailed, they had their equipment confiscated, they had their catch confiscated, families went hungry because they were violated. Violating the state fish and game law became a way of life. These two brothers, Fred and Mike Tribble from Le Coudray, they ended up creating a test case. And at Chief Lake is partially on Le Coudray and partially off Le Coudray. And they created a test case by spearing fish through the ice on the off-reservation side of the lake, where the state did not recognize their right to fish. And they were cited. And as I've been told the story by Alan Caldwell and others, one of the brothers had a copy of the treaty in his pocket. And he said, it says right here we can do this. And the game warden, in the way that I've been told the story, says, I don't know anything about that. Isn't that interesting? Right? He's not a villain. He's the guy charged with doing a job, and he's doing it to the best of his ability based on his understanding. What has he had the opportunity to learn about these treaties? Right? And so they took the case to court, and it was appealed, and they lost, and it was appealed, and they won. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, we don't need to hear this case, Seventh Circuit stands. Certiorari is denied. And so that Seventh Circuit upheld the reserve rights and said, you do have the right to hunt, fish, and gather. And the media said, the courts have given these rights. And everybody said, what? Because what was their opportunity to learn about these things? It was sort of a collective, I don't know anything about that. But a little less calmly. So Walter Brissett, the late Walter Brissett from Red Cliff, author, artist, and educator, and activist, He said no one in the state was prepared academically or intellectually for the court ruling. The state educational system and the media simply didn't know American law, much Indian law. So in the vacuum which was created by misinformation, emerged the ugly head of racism. Again, vacuum. No opportunity to learn. He says this, by the way, in a documentary film called Lighting the Seventh Fire, Sandra Sunrise in Osawa, 1995. And then there was the backlash. And I started at DPI in 1996, all right? And this is what 1989 looked like. 1989, we were on the nightly news, the national nightly news. Maybe some of you remember this. And that was live from Wisconsin. What? This is from just a bit earlier. This gentleman here, with the head of what appears to be supposed to be a native person on a bike. When asked in Lighting the Seventh Fire, what does this mean to you? He says, maybe it means I like Indians. Maybe it means I don't like Indians. What do you think it means? Okay, it means I think you're not communicating in good faith, is what I think it means. By 1996, when I would show this on my overhead slides, right? Overhead transparencies. I would say, how many of you have seen this? And anywhere I went, hands would go up. How many of you have seen this in real life? Hands would go up. And I'd say, where have you seen it? And no matter where I was, there was at least one person that said, I saw it here in this community. Right? And often folks think about this as, oh, it's those people up north. Right? I was over by Boscobel. I was over down by Milwaukee. I was in Janesville. I was wherever, and people would say, I saw it here. Right? It wasn't just an isolated thing. Now, there was an attempt to put a polite face on some of this. Right? And they say, you see that effigy hanging in Injun Joe, good Injun, referencing that, saying the only good Indian is dead Indian, right? And that's been attributed to one or another American generals over time. Custer had the right idea, harvest Indians, not fish. And their public pronouncement is this is purely an economic issue. Now, go back to, again, that notion of assertion of fact, right? They're taking all the fish, they will damage the fisheries. Detailed research has shown, going back to casting light upon the waters, that the fisheries are stronger than they have been, that the tribes have stocked Armada lakes, and that this is way more rigidly regulated than sport fishing. And so those things don't hold. I have a can of treaty beer in my office. It makes for an interesting conversation. That was one of their fundraisers, by the way, for some of these activities. And so we see this backlash. And of course, being an educator, I thought, where did the backlash come from? Because if you look at these, and if you see some of the still photos, if you look at some of the things in the Wisconsin Historical Society's digital archives on this time, you'll see sometimes 3 generations of people at the boat landings. People exercising their right to spear, and people violently protesting that right to spear. Multiple generations. So I got to thinking, okay, if I look at Grandpa, what was Grandpa's opportunity to learn? What years might he have been at school? If I look at Dad, what years might Dad have been in school? What were his opportunities to learn? What are they teaching that young one? Right? And so I got to thinking about this, and I did a deep run through in the history of social studies education, going back to 1912, because I'm kind of extra sometimes. But looking at social studies, and social studies really wasn't responding to any kind of social crisis. We entered World War II, December 7, 1941. There wasn't curriculum materials to help students understand what the war was about and about the sacrifices that they and their families were being asked to make. Till 1943, right? So there's this lag. And that there wasn't much on civil rights until 1968 and 9. If you look at some of the national social studies journals, some of these things, there were resources for teachers. And so Native people were largely invisible in all of these things. All of these things. Going back generations, there wasn't very much about Native people. I remember an activity I was reading about, and it was sort of like the computer game Oregon Trail that was all the rage when I was in like 2nd grade. And this was a role play kind of thing. And you could be a cook, you could be the wagon driver, you could be the guy who rode shotgun, you could be the pioneer wife, you could be this, that, and the other, you could be the doc, or you could be an Indian, right? Those were the roles that were available to students. So we have a nuanced understanding of one set of experiences and a very flat that perhaps maybe creates the illusion of an opportunity to learn. Well, Indians are included in that. You can be an Indian. No real opportunity to understand. And so I went through a lot of things, and I was working at the Department of Public Instruction. So I went through and did a deep dive in the archives about curriculum guides that we had put out and said, what is the state education agency telling schools they ought to be teaching? Pre-1989 now, right? Going way back, thinking again about what was Dad learning, what was Grandpa learning, those people with low learnings. And I went into Badger History Journal. And Badger History Journal is this really fascinating journal that went to every school in the state. It was published by the State Historical Society of Wisconsin between 1948 and 1980. My favorite issues are between 1948 and 1965 because what they include, remember I said we can only know what they had the opportunity to learn unless we have examples of student work? Badger History had examples of student work between 1948 and 1965, and you know what? It is a horror show. This is just one example called A Trip to Lac de Flambeau. Now, remember where this comes from. Think about the process, right? So that teacher, based on his or her opportunity to learn, is providing instruction about Native people, perhaps it seems like in this one, leading a field trip to Lac de Flambeau. The student produces this as part of a reflection. The Menominee Indians have a reservation there. Here, the Menominees performed a variety of Indian dances. That teacher says, this is exemplary student work, right? Sends it to Madison, to the Office of School Services, the Historical Society of Wisconsin, and they say, yes, indeed, this is exemplary student work. And they publish it in a document that goes out statewide as this is what good looks like. Who's got a reservation in Lac de Flambeau?
Ojibwe.
Lactaflammable Ojibwe. The Menominee people have a reservation on the Menominee Reservation. So this should have been caught at somewhere in that chain, you see?
gosh.
But this went out. Exploring Wisconsin, I spent my spring break in 2012, because I'm still fun, at my kitchen table in these 15-hour writing marathons, analyzing multiple editions of Exploring Wisconsin. Okay? It was fun. I was living on string cheese and mandarin oranges and granola bars and typing with one hand. Because if I wasn't done by May, I couldn't stay at UWGB May. Right? So that was my spring break. I ended up visiting the State Historical Society and asking them, I'm looking for textbook publication data. I'm looking for sales figures. Can you help me to determine if this was the leading textbook in Wisconsin? And if I say that, based on what? How widely might it have been adopted? DPI didn't know. Tried to find sales figures, nobody could find it. And the librarian at the State Historical Society says to me, I don't know, but perhaps you can ask your professor for further guidance. And I said, oh, ma'am, I don't think that'll work. And they said, oh, I'm sure they will understand. And I said, ma'am, I am the professor. And she lost all hope right then and there. So what I ended up doing is I'm saying this is one of the leading books, right? Inferring based on how many editions that there were and how many reprints that there were, suggested it was widely adopted and had some problematic stuff in it as well. So again, limited opportunities, some distorted messages. As part of my dissertation research, I did this deep dive down this rabbit hole of civics education in the 1960s. And I found some amazing stuff, right? Professionally, I came of age in the standards-based reform movement. And so we are thinking about, large-scale assessment and all of these things. And I found this statement, right? It's not about the weekly quiz or the unit test or the thing that you turn in at the end of the term. We must evaluate our academic efforts by the behavior of our alumni. How you living? What are you doing? Are you that good neighbor? Are you that engaged citizen? Or are you doing this based on what you've had the opportunity to learn or haven't had the opportunity to learn? And it's interesting to see how this all came about, right? And we see some initiatives that led to what we now know as Act 31 that go back to some work that was happening in school districts in the 1970s. And we see these things go forward, and we see that this was multiple entities, multiple organizations. It was a bipartisan effort to get this done because that 1989 spearing season, there was a real belief that someone would get killed at a Wisconsin bullpen. So we end up with people like Governor Thompson backing this reform. That's Sharon Metz in the upper right. And I knew her for a lot of years, and I did not know what a critical role she had played between about 1984-5 and 1987 when she ran for lieutenant governor. She did a ton of work on this. Frank Boyle from Superior got a lot of credit. He's the one that kind of carried the ball across the goal line. This gentleman here, State Superintendent Bert Grover. I wouldn't give it a whole week That bird Grover. But he was instrumental in getting it passed. So there's that. This gentleman is Alan Caldwell, the late Alan Caldwell, Menominee educator, and Uncle Al to me, right? Uncle by choice, not by blood. And if you were to do a Venn diagram of all of these organizations, Uncle Al is right in the middle. And if anyone could say, I did this, it would be him. But he always said, we did it, right? There were a lot of people involved that made it happen. We would always deflect that credit and acknowledge the number of others that were involved. And so I got to thinking about this, thinking about why the general public had such little understanding of history, culture, treaty rights, tribal sovereignty. Where did that come from? Limited opportunities to learn, right? And if we look at those broad trends in curriculum policy, it wasn't necessarily by design, it was just how all of these different things came together. But there was a very limited opportunity to learn. Official knowledge is an interesting concept. Official knowledge is along with that idea of the Menominee Reservational Act of Flambeau, right? It gets validated at these different levels by those who are recognized as knowers of stuff, right? And if we go back to that 4th grade history book, valid for 4th graders, right? That becomes official knowledge. And we see that Native educators, allies across the state, transformed curriculum policy to create something that, again, we kind of look at as, that's kind of vague, I don't know what to do with that, but was in 1989 the most specific requirement to date. I just taught a class on assessment over the summer, and thinking about real assessment, right? Here's the test. Remember I mentioned Alan Caldwell? Look at my Facebook status from August 4, 2015. I just submitted the latest draft of Chapter 5 to the Godfather himself. He's mentioned my name 27 times. So if there's anyone who's going to ensure I get the story right, it's Uncle Al. He's been an important teacher for me. This feels like a final exam. Have I been paying attention? We will soon see. And it came up in my this day in Facebook history kind of thing. 2018. This, my friends, is high stakes assessment. It's likely the closest I will ever come to Woody Allen's Marshall McLuhan moment. You know nothing of my work. Luckily, Uncle Al gave me his A-OK with just one fairly minor edit. That's how you ensure you get the story right. And you'll see, again, thinking about relational accountability. I owed him that to get the story right. Thinking about the way that I acknowledge those who were my teachers. Again, that relational accountability became this book, that Spring of Food. And so this is where it comes from, right? But the controversy itself, this is the takeaway. The controversy itself really reflects limited opportunities to learn. And it's curriculum policy, not social policy, right? We have the habit of saying the schools will do it because we have kids kind of collected all in one place, so schools will do those things that meet the needs of kids, but they're not necessarily about teaching and learning, right? This is about teaching and learning. And that opportunity to learn is absolutely key. Right? Opportunity to learn is absolutely key. And as we think about opportunities for lifelong learning, and as we think about those of you in that room, in this room, that are at that point where you are adults, right? And Basil Johnston's teachings is sharing those Ojibwe stories about the 4 hills of life. recognize all of you as being responsible for seeking out those things that you want to learn. And I am very much encouraged by, it's a cold day, the roads are icy, Packers pregame is coming up soon, and to see this many people in the room, to see that there are people online here, and that you've come to spend the afternoon with me and with each other, and that you're in the process of participating in Door County Reads, where you're reading Braiding Sweetgrass for Young Adults. And I think that's just the coolest thing. I've not had the opportunity to meet Robin Kimmerer, but I've used her materials in my classroom. I've read, I've been told I shouldn't say adult books because that means something else. But the book for an adult audience, right? Her name, Braiding Sweetgrass, the initial version. I read that, and it was really kind of transformative, right? I thought I wasn't really a science guy. But she brought me into conversation with the whole series of ideas that I hadn't fully embraced before, right? And so, to see that that opportunity is being reconfigured for a younger audience and being made available more broadly, that's really cool. And I think about, when I was writing my book, the editor said, I want you to write for old ladies in tennis shoes. What? And she said, that's who our readers are at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. Think about that. I wrote most of my book at my grandmother's kitchen table. I had a real life old lady in tennis shoes who was my test reader, right? And Grandma kind of had this thought that if I couldn't explain it to where it was pretty straightforward, that I probably didn't understand it well enough and needed to rethink it, right? And so that's the way I think about this, right? Is that this is being made even more accessible. It's not dumbing it down, not flipping through it. It's making it more accessible. And I just very much appreciate her and all of the work that she's done. And again, most of my students that are in my intro class are there for general education. And so if I can hook them with the $750 billion economic footprint of the Oneida Nation, or if I can hook them with, we're talking about science too, right? It makes it real and relevant to a whole different audience. Here's the other thing. As we think about history, culture, and tribal sovereignty as sort of the Act 31 language, there's this metaphor that Zaretta Hammond has created. It's a tree metaphor for culture. And some of you may know the iceberg metaphor of culture, right? Is that only the top third of an iceberg is visible. There are only certain elements of culture that we can see, right? We see song and dance and clothing and foodways and those kind of things, but those are all manifestations of something else, right? With a tree, as opposed to an iceberg, a tree is a living thing. An iceberg is not a living thing, and an iceberg is dangerous, right? If we think about culture as a tree, it is not dangerous. It is one of those things that we exist in relationship with in some good and powerful ways. And so it allows us to think about culture in some very layered ways, some very complex ways, and it recognizes that those things that we can see are expressions of those things that we cannot. And I would encourage you, as you continue to read Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, think about how those teachings, those stories, are things about relationship to nature and animals. For example, definition of kinship and group identity. All of these things are manifest in that book. And that this also reflects lifelong learning in community and in relationship. And so I just think all of what you're doing is so important. And I'm so grateful to have been part of it. I'm thankful for your attention today, in person, as well as hello out there at TV land again. And I'm just grateful to have been part of this kickoff. And the way I always think about it is that you could have been anywhere today, and you chose to be here. And I'm grateful for that. And so I'll leave this up in case Dominic, Christina, or Alan, or others are going to talk about some of the things that are upcoming. And I'll leave it there. I'll turn it back to them, and I can answer questions if you'd like to.
Thank you.